Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Marcus Messner. I'm the interim director of the Richard T. Robertson School of Media and Culture here at Virginia Commonwealth University. And if you've been at some of our past events, you know we've discussed the weaponization of social media, the blackface scandal here in Virginia, and more recently we had an opportunity for civil discourse in an uncivil age, which we're all living in today. Today we will hear from Carolina Espinal, who is the founder of Mozaic Strategies and a member of the Board of Visitors here at VCU. She will speak about how diversity and inclusion are transforming business and society. We're excited to present you this event on the last day of Hispanic Heritage Month, and you will all have a chance to ask Carolina Espinal questions after her presentation, and we will be coming around with a microphone. And we hope that you will also contribute to the discussion on social media. Please do so on our Facebook page, the Robertson School, on Twitter and Instagram. Please use the hashtag VCURobertson. For our VCU students, if you're receiving extra credit for your attendance tonight, please hold on to your extra credit slips. We'll collect them after the event, and you can drop them in our box that will be there after the event. I'd like to give special thanks tonight to our video crew, which is run by students under the supervision of my colleague Gary Gillum. They're taping this event for possible broadcast on the local PBS station here in Richmond, VPM, and you'll also be able to view it on our Robertson School website in the coming days. Before we get started with the event, I would like to recognize the namesake of our Robertson School in the audience here tonight. He flew in from Los Angeles with his lovely wife, Olga. Richard T. Robertson, if you could just stand for a second.
Class of 1967. When I used to come here over the years, when I was parents weren't alive. But anyway, go Rams, and great that you're here tonight.
Thanks for being here.
To do this series, and I think it's one of the best things our school has ever done, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. I'd also like to welcome the chair of our advisory board, Mr. Chet Wade, who is with us as well tonight. Thanks for being here. With that, I'd like to turn over the microphone to our Robertson School professor, Vivian Medina Messner, who has been an instructor in our journalism sequence since 2011, and who teaches our diversity in the media class this semester. Prior to entering academia, she worked as a content producer for Media General Interactive here in Richmond and as an online producer for MiamiHerald.com. She also worked as a business columnist for the Spanish language newspaper El Nuevo Herald and worked as a Spanish consultant for the blogging platform Tumblr. As a Colombian American herself, she's a regular speaker on Latinx and diversity issues. Tonight, she'll be the moderator for our event and will be introducing our speaker. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. It's great to be here, to see so many familiar faces, and again, thank you so much for joining us and for being here. Well, before we begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Carolina Espinal. She is a newly appointed member of the VCU Board of Visitors. She founded Mozaic Strategies, a consultancy advancing the creation of more inclusive culture in and outside of the workplace. As a senior advisor to public and private sector leaders and organizations, she delivers dynamic expertise in diversity and inclusion, public affairs, and reputation management. Formerly a senior strategist with Brunswick Group, she led the inclusion and diversity practice and served as the lead advisor on the launch and CEO action on diversity and inclusion, the largest CEO-driven initiative focused on D&I in the workplace. She began her career as a civil rights advocate working on behalf of communities of color at Unidos US, and later led the NAACP's National Civic Engagement Policy Platform. She has led political engagement strategies and outreach for federal, state, and local campaigns. A resident of Arlington County, Espinal is the proud daughter of immigrants and a graduate of the University of Virginia and Harvard University. All right, let's welcome Carolina.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marcus and Vivian, for the invitation. Thanks to you for this wonderful school that you have built a legacy, that we've built a legacy on. I consider myself now part of the VCU family. I even inadvertently wore the colors, so I feel like I'm in here. But I also just want to thank all of you, members of the student body, but also members of the community that have come out to talk about, or at least learn maybe something new about issues of diversity and inclusion. I have a few confessions before we get started. The first being, I really don't like public speaking. But you know, in the course of this work, it's something that you have to do. So my little trick, and I just have to hope that you all play along here, is in public speaking engagements, I usually just like to pretend that I'm having a conversation with my friends and family. So I hope that you all will consider yourselves part of the Friends and Family Network as we have this conversation. And you know, feel free to save your questions to the end, because I'd love to make sure that we have time to cover off on some of those. The second confession is that I have unconscious biases, and we all do in this room. So I'm going to do my best to express myself and express what I have seen and what I have learned in the course of doing this work, but inadvertently I will miss maybe a constituency that's important to you, or a characteristic that you reflect, or a community that you belong to. And I just want to make sure that you know that that's not on purpose, but we are on the clock here, so I can only cover so much. And if anything, I hope that it opens up your minds and your conversations outside of this room. So that's confession number 2. And confession number 3 is I'm especially proud to be having this conversation on the final day of Hispanic Heritage Month, primarily because we're living at a time when people like me, who look like me or who culturally connect like me, are facing some pretty intense and serious issues related to inclusion in our country. So I'm proud to at least be here and be a voice for the folks that can't be in the room. And hopefully we will, as we explore certain conversations, learn a little bit more about my community, my background, and the constituencies that I've worked with. And then the last confession, I promise, is that this is not going to be an exhaustive conversation, because it is impossible to talk about everything related to diversity and inclusion in the time that we have tonight. I'm going to do my best to give you a cursory view of, you know, an illustrative sampling of what I have seen and what I have learned over the course of the past decade working on these issues, specifically in corporate America. We're going to be looking at how business and society have intersected around issues of diversity and inclusion, and what it's doing to change how we speak to each other, what we think about one another, and how we act. So I hope that you all will find plenty to talk about in the Q&A section, and I'm going to work my way over to the PowerPoint, because I have a few slides that I hope are just going to help keep us on course. Whoops. Sorry about that. Here we go. Slideshow. Am I missing it? Maybe. Here we go. There we go. All right. So the first thing I want to start with is a quick definition, or a set of definitions. It's not perfect, but it's going to give you a sense of what diversity and inclusion actually mean. A lot of people think diversity and inclusion is all about people of color or women or people with disabilities, and they're actually two really different concepts, right? The first, when we think about diversity, it's usually what people think about, right? All of the range of capabilities, experiences, perspectives, characteristics, you know, ranging from race and ethnicity all the way to political views. The second, which is inclusion, is much more about the environment in which we are asking people to be a part of, or letting people be a part of, or allowing people to belong, any one of those phrases. And in short, she said it best, Verna Myers, when she said, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think anybody who's in the room has been to a party and has been asked to dance at some point in their lives, or asked somebody to dance, so I think we can all relate to that. But what I want to get to in terms of setting the premise of our conversation today is to talk about, when we think about diversity and inclusion, and when we think about the various lenses we're looking through. Oftentimes we're looking through many of these lenses on the left. So you'll see gender, race and ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ+, and veteran status, right? At least in corporate America, those are kind of the main frameworks that they're using when they're talking about diversity. One of the issues that has been emerging increasingly is the dimension of age, and specifically intergenerational and intragenerational engagement. And a lot of this started around, folks, many of you may be millennials, many may be Gen Z. I'm admittedly Gen X. I'm okay admitting that. But what I would say is right now we're living in a time and a place in the workplace where you have potentially 4 generations at work together, and 4 generations who deal with a myriad of issues really differently. You have a generation that still picks up the newspaper in the morning. How many people in this room, actually, let me pause here. How many people in the room pick up a newspaper every day? Okay. All right. How many people turn on the news on the TV? Okay, at least for one news cycle, all right. How many people get an online newsletter that has already aggregated the news for you? I personally love the Skim. I recommend that, especially if it's tailored for young women. Okay, newsletters, I'm sorry, I didn't see that one. Okay, so a good healthy chunk of newsletter people. And how many of you scroll Twitter to find out what's happening? All right, so that's a bigger chunk, right? Is there anything else that people do to find news? All right, what do we have here? Okay, podcast. Yes, you're right. Okay, so how many people, I listen to NPR daily. How many people are radio or podcast people? All right, so we've got a good chunk of folks of podcast world as well. Excellent. So when we think about the inter and intra-generational aspect of diversity and inclusion, we should also think about how those different generations are receiving news, how you're receiving what's happening in the world, what's informing your thoughts, right? There was recently an NPR segment, an NPR series on who's talking to who. And that is very, the highlight of that was very much the point of that was conservatives are listening to conservative outlets and liberals are listening to liberal outlets. And oftentimes, folks you're not benefiting from hearing multiple sides of an issue. And is that handicapping us in our perspectives? So interesting. I'm happy to kind of provide that source later. But I thought it was an interesting perspective, specifically because when it's based on how we're consuming media on a regular basis anyways. All right. So some of the underpinnings that are related to those lenses that corporate America is using to categorize us as consumers or employees or partners or shareholders, they're also needing to build a stronger understanding around the underpinnings of what those lenses provide, right? Just because I'm a woman doesn't say anything about where I grew up, what my values are, what my education level is, what my sexual orientation is, how I vote, what my work style is. It doesn't say any of those things. Those things are all important because they all come to work with you every day, or they all come to school with you every day, or they all go to your intramural sports team every day. So those underpinnings are really important. Now to get into the meaty stuff, When it comes to corporate America, one of the most important things to them is obviously the bottom line, right? We all know, we've all heard about the bottom line, and basically their profits. But the profits hinge on something really important, which is their reputation. And there's nothing that companies protect or try to protect more than their reputation, because it is what gives you the gateway to operate. It is your license to operate in society. And in today's society, the license to operate, the fee for the license to operate has gone up. Before, when I first entered the corporate sector about 10 years ago, I was coming from a background in civil rights activism and in social justice work and political campaigns. I can't skip that part. But I was coming from work that was very much focused on mobilizing communities around the issues they care about. And when I came to corporate America, the issue they cared about was their reputation. And they wanted to be known as the lead in their sector or their industry. They wanted to be known as the innovator. They wanted to be known as the next big thing, even though they're the current big thing. And when they communicated about issues of diversity and inclusion, it was primarily to say, we've got this really great thing we're doing. Won't you applaud us for that, right? It was some big announcement, some new person they hired, some program they partnered with. And so it was more around an announcement. There were also moments where they issued reports. Here's the state of our corporate social responsibility. Here's what we're doing around diversity and inclusion. And then every now and then, there were problems. There was somebody in leadership who maybe made a faux pas, said something inappropriate. There was maybe a product recall. Maybe there was an investment in something that was a challenge in their supply chain. And those were the moments where they engaged on issues of diversity and inclusion. That last one is AKA a crisis, right? And I think we've all seen companies go through a crisis. Today, however, I think, and I'll talk through a specific timeline, but today, companies are being asked more and more to take a position around issues that have usually made them very uncomfortable. Talking about issues of women's rights, social justice, immigrant rights, those things usually mean you're getting into the political arena. And I mean that with a capital letter P as much as I mean it with a lowercase letter p. And people don't usually want to do that, because if you take a political with a capital P, partisan position, it could have real kind of implications for your funds. So what do we do now, right? Let me backtrack before I get to that reveal slide. I usually try to think about things in 2 generations or 2 iterations. The first being before 2014. Before 2014, and essentially between 2008, when Barack Obama is elected as the first black president, or the 44th president, but essentially he is the first black president, there's a new world order in Washington, especially when it comes to corporate America. Corporate America had really benefited from something called the lobbying industry, and they would oftentimes be known for taking the fast track into the White House, the fast track into Congress, through relationships to talk about the things that they cared about. And oftentimes they were able to influence policy, influence action. And when Barack Obama, as a candidate, said, we're going to take no private money, no lobbying dollars, we're going to take no lobbying dollars. And he eventually wins, he comes into the White House and continues to apply that philosophy. So his disposition with corporate America, or his position with corporate America, really set a new precedence. So if you were going to, as a company, do something that was benefiting society, good, you should. I'm not going to, Barack Obama, I am not going to pat you on the back or salute you or write a press release about you because you did something that you're supposed to be doing. I may give you a nod. I may let you in so that we can create some sort of public-private partnership, and we will then look at what's next. But you're going to get no freebies out of me. And between that period and 2014, many companies were repositioning themselves. And one of the things that you saw dynamically changing in corporate America was the creation, and in some cases, the evolution of something called the Chief Diversity Officer role. And the Chief Diversity Officer role was meant to be kind of like the ombudsman of diversity in a company. So if there's anything happening within the company, in the supply chain, or in the employee base, or wherever, you could go to the Chief Diversity Officer and put this in their hopper, and they were the curator of that matter. They would be the public speakers. They would go out and help build the reputation of the company, talking about all the things the company was doing on diversity and inclusion. Now, that role was oftentimes, in some case, I would say was more than often buried in something called the HR function. So if you think about it, you have the CEO. The CEO usually has their lieutenants. And under the lieutenant, one of the lieutenants is usually an HR executive. And then somewhere in the lieutenants of the HR executive would be the Chief Diversity Officer. The companies that were really innovative and that were really trying to do something were embedding the Chief Diversity Officer on level with the lieutenants. And those were very few companies. Most of the time, if they were not in the HR function, they were similarly in what's known as a CSR, or corporate social responsibility function. So either way, they were not reporting to the boss directly. Hence, the boss was not necessarily engaged in the day-to-day discussions around some pretty critical issues. So what happens? I'm sorry, to get to the punchline here, 2014 changes everything. And it starts, in my opinion, with one hashtag on Twitter, Black Lives Matter. Now, I think everybody in the room here was either in high school, college already, or a working professional. And we all know what hashtag Black Lives Matter is, and it's still alive and well. Its roots are really essentially in the Trayvon Martin case, which started and ended in 2013. But it wasn't until 2014 when they started a series of national protests. Protests in cities across the country where people were talking about criminal justice, racial justice, and so forth. And so Black Lives Matter became not just a new paradigm for activism, it became the new paradigm for communicating around critical issues and causing things to move fast. So shortly after Black Lives Matter starts marching down the streets of a city near you, Jesse Jackson, the known civil rights leader, goes to Silicon Valley and starts knocking on doors. And the first door he knocked on was Facebook's door. Who here has a Facebook account? Right. I don't, but okay. But let's say, okay, so he shows up, knocks on Facebook's door, and says, I want to see the numbers. I want to see how many Black people work at Facebook, specifically. And then you can give me the numbers on the other groups. But I want to know how many Black people. Why? Because Black people were using Facebook and Twitter, for that matter, more than anybody else on the planet. And there were minimal numbers of Black people, engineers or executives, and everyone in between, who were working at the company. And so he does this all the way through Silicon Valley, Google, Twitter. I mean, he literally knocked on everybody's door, and everybody, guess what, had the same response. Well, the numbers aren't there yet, but we're working on it. How can you help us find the African American employees that we need to boost our numbers? So, okay, so that starts a conversation, right? All of a sudden, it starts to create a ripple effect, and other companies outside of the tech sector start to think about, I need to get ahead of this. I don't want to be front page above the fold on any news outlet. I need to start thinking about what my narrative is going to be and how I'm going to respond to these questions when they come knock on my door. So that continues to cascade. As that continues to cascade, we see an upping of the ante on violence. And the first major act of that was the shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church. And that shooting really kind of created a whole different dynamic around race. And we started to think about, okay, it's not just speech, it's now actually action. People are willing to go into a place of worship. So one is you're going to kill people who are worshiping, and two, you're killing black people who happen to also, who happen to be worshiping. So there were two dimensions of that were really dangerous. Shortly after was the Pulse nightclub shooting, predominantly LGBTQ nightclub. And then shortly after that, North Carolina decides we're going to create a bathroom bill because we want people to go to the bathroom related to the sex with which they were born. And that starts to really open the door on LGBTQ and specifically trans rights. And then, if not the most pivotal point in this whole dynamic that's beginning to build, is the election of Donald Trump. And regardless of what your political views may be, one of the messages that, for me, resonated the most, and I know that it resonated among the highest of his supporters, was the issue of immigration. Because if we can all remember, it wasn't too long ago that he was going to build the wall. And that was the rally cry that to me was the antithesis to hope and change. Now, has anybody in this room read this book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point? All right. Comms people, media and culture people, you have to read this book. It is incredibly timely. I actually brought a copy if anybody wants to take a look at it. We can raffle it or something at the end. But this book literally tells you, it breaks down the nuances of how a message is created and how it is put in a population of people to achieve a certain outcome. Malcolm would be disappointed with that summary, but in short, it literally is about building a message that spreads like an epidemic. And to me, as somebody who worked on a political campaign in 2008, our message, our epidemic was hope and change. And as a voter, many years later, I saw the same paradigm used to push a build the wall message or lock her up message. And that was really dangerous. And it felt very threatening to me as an American. So from that point, I think you'll see the biggest, most intense moments follow. And those range from the Women's March the day before inauguration, which had millions of women in the US but around the world protesting that election. But it also led to a cascade of bigger things that are really defining how business interacts with society today. So if you think about the election and the Women's March in January, I personally will come back to the CEO action on diversity and inclusion in a moment, but if you think that's January, 7 months later in Charlottesville, we all know what happened. When the Unite the Right rally was being organized and taking place. That then is followed by, shortly thereafter in October, Me Too. Hashtag Me Too started with one tweet. It literally started with one tweet and became a movement. Actually, today is the second anniversary for Me Too. So, for anyone that is celebrating today, I know I am. But what I will say is that, I think I did a little something here, I apologize. Me Too was a big moment. And then, okay, there we go, sorry. And then we see, if we were to dive down just on the women's point of what's after Me Too. Me Too literally began or set up what would later become the protests around the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. It also set up what happened with the formation of the legal defense fund known as Time's Up, which now isn't just, about women speaking to a hashtag. It's about women taking people to court and women fighting for their rights and fighting to be heard and to be listened to and to be acknowledged. So those, you see a lot of the bubbling up of the activity around the women's space. You see a lot of the bubbling up around the activity in the race and ethnicity space, and that, over the past, 3 years almost, has been almost exclusively focused on immigrants. While there's been a continuation of the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversations around criminal justice, and there have been even recent tragedies as of this past weekend, the conversations around immigration have really become quite toxic and dangerous. It's not just about anti-immigrant language and white supremacist language that we're seeing in mainstream media, that we're seeing spoken by the president in kind of everyday outlets that are reaching everyday people, but it's also in policy. It's impacting policy, creating family separation policy that keeps kids in cages, literally and figuratively speaking. But something that began as a call for a border crisis has really continued, and I think we all need to keep an eye on that. But not everything was negative. There were some real big wins when it came to issues of diversity and inclusion the past couple of years. And I think one of the biggest wins was certainly the midterm elections of 2018, where we saw 112 women elected, newly elected women. We saw 23 people of color elected. And then, we saw 10 members of the LGBTQ plus community elected, making it one of the most diverse Congress, incoming Congresses that we've ever seen, or the most diverse Congress that we've seen. So I think that was a big positive. And there were also some other positives, like Black Panther reaching, record highs at the box office with an all-Black lead cast, both in front of the camera as well as behind the camera. And then, of course, who can forget Crazy Rich Asians? I love that movie, and I love the book too. But that was the highest grossing romantic comedy in 10 years across the board. And it just happened to be an Asian-focused narrative with Asian-focused actors and Asian-focused production team. And that was cool, I think, especially to watch and to watch the enthusiasm. How many people saw people dressed up, and crossing their arms like they were going to Wakanda, for Black Panther? It was great. So unfortunately, I wish I had better news at this time of the year, but we're rounding the clock on the fourth quarter, and had one of the saddest moments happen not too long ago in El Paso with someone who literally drove for hours to go to a Walmart to specifically kill Mexicans. And that, is unacceptable. It's at this point where the danger of your words becomes real. And these are the things that media, in some cases, because everything that I've mentioned so far was covered extensively by the media, by top-tier mainstream media. It was covered by specialty media as well. I followed the Spanish language outlets, and they were covering every single one of these issues for almost the same period of time. They definitely were all conversations had on social media. So we were all participating, those of us that raised our hands. There are still podcasts on this stuff. So for those that listen to podcasts, there's still plenty of material out there. And, this is just kind of a sampling of some of how D&I was showing up in the business conversations. And some of the things that, under the pressure of all those things that you saw, all those activities that you saw in the previous slide, these were just some of the headlines, The New York Times posting on the moral voice of corporate America. The New York Times is the one who broke Me Too. The Washington Post broke the kids in cages and the separation of families. So I think you're seeing a lot of the business community trying to find their angle to understanding the issues. And in some cases, they're thinking, oh, well, what can I do? Is there something in my diversity and inclusion program, platform, representative, as in the chief diversity officer or otherwise, that I need to be doing? And the resounding answer back to companies was, we don't want to hear from the chief diversity officer. We want to hear from the CEO. He or she has got to step to the plate and tell us what's going on. And they have to tell us what their company is doing about these issues. I want to know that when whoever, or when the president or someone else says, we got to build the wall, I want to know if the company that I spend my money on is okay with doing that. And if not, then I as an individual, need to start engaging in a conversation around, and that creates some pressure around that. And you specifically saw companies like Salesforce, Apple, and others really start moving quickly to divest from things that were connected to controversial issues. There were some other really positive things as well. In this chaos of issues and conversation, there were really a number of new outlets created, a number of new platforms created, some from traditional media outlets and outfits, and others from newer outfits. So you had something like, I personally love what Fortune has done. Fortune has created a platform for women called the Broadsheet, and which literally gives you a daily dose, a daily breakdown of issues globally impacting women. And they have something called Race Ahead, which gives you the snapshot of what's happening on race and diversity, race and inclusion around the country. It's mostly US specific, but both of those are excellently curated outlets or platforms, and I strongly encourage you to take a look. Huffington Post was one of the first to create platforms, Huffington Post Black Voices, Latino Voices, LGBTQ Voices, etc. So they almost created a model that was replicated by other companies. Then you have organizations like the Harvard Business Review. This was not a topic that was regularly taught at the Harvard Business School, but the issue started to permeate the C-suite. So CEOs and their boards of directors, these really powerful people that nobody really sees and doesn't really know who's in the club, but make all the decisions around companies, they all started to get a little bit worried about what was happening. So you saw them kind of starting to tune in and being reflected in some of these media outlets. So this I meant to just highlight, since it is the anniversary of Me Too, just to give you a snapshot of what a traditional media outlet was saying, uh-oh, the reckoning is coming, and what the outputs really looked like. With one tweet, literally, by Alyssa Milano on that day, asking people, saying, this happened to me. If something like this has happened to you, say it and hashtag Me Too. And it led to almost 2 million tweets. So at the end of that year, Time Magazine, who normally profiles a person, profiled the Me Too movement as the person of the year, and gave a hat tip to all the women around the world, because this has now become a global movement, and honored them as the person of the year. The point that I want to make, which as somebody who's worked in the corporate world, and I think was most eye-opening for me, was that in that year, over 200 CEOs lost their jobs. Literally, swift action. To think that in 1 year, behavior, the radar of behavior, or the acceptability, or the radar of acceptable behavior has shifted so much that in 1 year, over 200 CEOs were removed. And about half of the replacement CEOs were women. replacement CEOs or replacement interim CEOs were women. So that to me was a swift action with swift results. Now, one of my personal favorite CEOs, because of their ability to jump into the conversation around diversity and inclusion and be publicly engaged in the media about it, is Marc Benioff of Salesforce. And Marc Benioff has made big bets, leveraging his business to say, we're going to do things like reduce the pay gap, the gender pay gap in our company in a year. And he's made that commitment and done that, achieved that over 3 years. So he did it the first year. They acquired another company or another set of companies. There was a pay gap in that acquisition. He remedied that in a year. The following year, year 3, they acquired more companies where they inherited more pay gaps, and he remedied that in a year as well. There are other companies. Starbucks made a big bet on reducing the gender pay gap in a year. It took them 10 years to figure it out, and they did it. Unfortunately, about 2 months after they did that, they had an incident in Philadelphia where 2 African Americans were arrested for not leaving a Starbucks. And they had a new CEO. The new CEO was on the job, I think, about a month after the legacy of Howard Schultz, the CEO at the time, had taken a step back. A new CEO on the job, and this is his induction into Starbucks world. And he has to solve this problem. And what does he do? He literally gets on a plane and gets to Philadelphia. And I've done a lot of crisis management. I'd be happy to share some war stories with you all. But, watching this new CEO get off a plane, he's like all disheveled, his hair is crazy, he doesn't have a tie, he just got off the plane. He shows up in front of news cameras to say, we're going to figure out what happened, we're going to fix this. Because he knows that now the buck stops with him. The accountability stops with him. So back to Marc Benioff and the whole point of CEOs really owning the role and responsibility and accountability that they're now being held to. He stepped up. He actually has a book out, and this is not a plug for his book because I haven't read it yet. But he has come out to say that CEOs, companies in general, have to start thinking differently about how they do business. And they've got to start not just thinking about their shareholders and their investors and their reputation externally and their media hits and their whatever it may be. They need to start thinking about the end user. They need to start thinking about the consumers. They need to start thinking about the stakeholders that are coming down the pipeline that are potentially going to be their employees. They got to start thinking about their current employees. And these are all things that I think make sense in today's day and age. McKinsey has put out a report for the past several years really making the case for why diversity and inclusion has a positive impact on your bottom line. It's a proven case. 10 years ago when I came into the work, you had to make the case for why companies should be investing in Latino communities, in the disabled, in pick your segment. And now it's more like it makes a lot of financial sense. And if your teams are more diverse, you're gonna start thinking about more innovative ideas. If your leadership is more diverse, if you have women in your C-suite or on your boards, you're going to start thinking differently. You'll start moving differently. You'll start hiring differently, etc. So there really is, if you need to lean on the business case for why diversity matters for business, you can always use this stat. But I think everything we've talked about so far really makes a stronger case. It's now almost not an option. So CEO for Action for Diversity and Inclusion was one of the items on the timeline that I shared earlier. It's an initiative that I worked on specifically and that launched in June of 2017, just 7 weeks before Charlottesville. And the only reason why I think it's still one of the hallmarks of what we've seen in the past few years is it was the first time that over 150 CEOs came together and said, okay, we know something's happening, there's something in the water. This Black Lives Matter thing, the women, the Me Too thing, there are a million things happening. And we need to start getting smart on these issues and figure out what our formal place is going to be. So this coalition, if you will, convened Pepsi and Coke, Under Armour and Nike, AT&T and Verizon. It convened people across sectors and industries that would be competitors. It would convene legacy companies like the IBMs of the world. It convened startup companies. It convened companies big and small. It convened some academic institutions. And it began to kind of create a platform for CEOs to start saying, we care. Let's come up with the baseline things that we care about. And let's come up with a pledge. So the pledge is roughly, 1, we the CEOs are going to be, engaged. This is not going to be something I relegate to somebody else in my organization. I'm going to be at the table. 2, there's this thing around unconscious bias, and we need to be focused on it. And I'm not reading them in order, so sorry if you're following along. But 2, there's this thing around unconscious bias, and we have to get serious about it. There was a growing body of research around what are the biases that each of us have. Because I'm a person of color does not mean I don't have any biases. I do. I have plenty. I need to start identifying them, understand how to deconstruct some of them, and understand the biases I create in other people's minds, in the workplace, at school, at church, wherever. Okay, so we're going to start breaking that down. We need to find some sort of training mechanism to implement unconscious bias training in the environments that we can control as CEOs. And where is that? The workplace, right? So they also talked about finding a way to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. Honestly, here are the good things that we do. We have invested in doing employee training for years. This is really good. We're very proud of this. I don't care if it was a large-scale program or small-scale program. They needed to start talking about that. Other companies said, you know what? We started a conference. Okay, fine. So starting to share what they were doing, where they were doing in real time. And being unafraid to say, this is all I can do right now, but I'm going to learn from what the other people post up on our portal, and maybe those are things that we can learn from as best practices. And then they were going to actually craft strategic plans. So this wasn't just going to be, I'm going to show up to a board meeting or a CEO action meeting once a quarter. Nope. It was you're going to create a plan in your organization, and you are going to communicate that plan publicly. Everything that CEO Action talked about and organized around, starting with the pledge and ending with these strategic plans, were things that they were willing to share publicly. They created a website, they started to make the information publicly available, and that created a mechanism of accountability. So if anybody said, AT&T, what are you doing on these issues of diversity and inclusion? And they're actually a pretty sophisticated company that does a lot. They said, you know what, we do a lot, but we put our best 3 practices up on the CEO Action website. And if you can't find it there, we have tons of websites available company-wide, enterprise-wide, that will tell you the things that we do for our people, for our communities, and for our shareholders. Okay, so where does this leave us now? And we're kind of rounding home now. This leaves us in a lot of places. But I've kind of tried to narrow down. I told you guys I couldn't cover everything, that I try to cover some of the bigger moments. And they're the bigger moments from, again, my perspective, professionally as well as personally, but it's certainly not everything that we've seen. So the 3 things that I've kind of identified as areas where the challenge is before us. The first is immigration. So I lost track of the number of days that where we started this whole conversation of the immigrants are coming to get us, for lack of a better phrase. The build a wall days, I forgot how long it's been, but nearly 3 years. We've surpassed the family separation conversation. We've surpassed the kids in cages. We've even surpassed the El Paso shooting. But there are 60 million Latinos in the US. Approximately 11, 12 million of them are undocumented, give or take, maybe. But the bigger thing is, Latinos aren't the only immigrants. There are immigrants from Asia, Africa, Europe. They're from everywhere. Immigrants are everywhere, right? And yeah, and we, literally and figuratively speaking, we are among us. We are among ourselves. My parents, for example, my mother came to the US. This is her 50th year anniversary. So my mom came as a girl from Nicaragua. My dad came from Dominican Republic. My stepdad is Mexican. My stepmom is Salvadorian. My aunt is Filipino. The other one's Eritrean, Somali. I mean, you name it, right? We're now living in that type of America. We're now living in an America where your significant other, your neighbor, your friend, your roommate, your classmate could potentially be from somewhere else. So when we think about the essence of being American and the fact that we have all kind of ascribed to the idea that this is a nation of immigrants, and we're now in this space where things like white supremacy are challenging that premise and creating a school of thought that says we're not that anymore, or we're not that for a certain type of immigrant. The onus is on us to get smart on these issues, to understand what the policy implications are, to understand how these issues are being communicated in media, to use our own voices to communicate. If you're on social and you see the conversations going a certain way, you may choose to engage or not engage, but if anything, you should follow along and see what people are saying. The second thing is climate change. So we've all been, I think, recently hearing a lot about climate change. We've been out of the Paris Accords, which was the formal global agreement around climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and a number of other things. But we've been out of it for a bit now. And I thought one of the most, interesting moves that got a lot of coverage on climate change, there were two. One was almost overnight, the Amazon, the lungs of the earth, are on fire. And it was a hashtag, Pray for the Amazon, that really sent this conversation from zero media coverage to everybody's covering it for 2 weeks. It literally was something on Instagram, moved to Twitter, and then took off. And, recently we saw the activists, we've seen young activists, we've seen Gen Z step up to the plate. And Gen Z is, I think there may even be some Gen Zers in the room here, but Gen Z is hard charging on this issue and not relenting. And those of us that don't step up to support them and join them and even just take a moment to hear what they're saying, because they're saying it pretty loud and clear, pretty concisely, and through a variety of outlets, it is our planet as well. So I think that's going to be a big conversation that gets us into a global discussion, not just a US discussion, which I think the immigration issue is still quite US focused. And then, of course, the 2020 elections. I think most of us here, if we did not vote in the last election, or we're not eligible to vote yet in the last election, we're all eligible to vote now, I think. And we've seen, I personally, I was just talking to somebody earlier today about how I feel so browbeaten by the Democratic Party. And I'm a Democrat, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I've worked for the party for many years, but I feel browbeaten. I'm tired of the debates. I personally don't want to hear from 20 candidates. I would like to see how we as a community coalesce around an agenda, or a series of agenda items Clearly, we know what the right of center, we know the president is going to be the candidate, and we know many of his positions already. But I am curious to see how we move from some of the 25 debates. It's not 25, but you know what I mean. It's a lot of debates. Yeah, it's a lot. And tonight, yes, I don't want to plug that one though. No plugs, no free plugs. But what I do have to say has been really interesting. I would have done it completely differently, but to see there is an entire series of town halls on LGBTQ plus policy. What do you have to say? I thought that was really telling. There's a whole climate town hall series. That's really telling. And those things don't just happen because a media executive wants it to happen. They happen because there's a confluence of things. There are people, creating a conversation or demanding a conversation. And I think, that's why we're seeing that. So we have to get smart on that. And I think businesses are also getting smart on that. I think they're doing it in tandem with everyday people. They're trying to figure out who's going to be the best candidate for my business, who's going to be the best candidate for my consumers, who's going to help me get the best tax break or have access to the employee base that I'm going to want to build the innovative things that I'm building. So I think we all it's on us to kind of keep an eye on these three segments, or at least from my point of view, and to see how companies organize around these things, right? It's not just Patagonia on climate change. It's who else is saying something on climate change. It's not just whoever on immigration. Right now, it's a slim group. But Salesforce, for example, is somebody who said something on immigration. Who else is saying stuff on immigration? And then the last thing. This is just for fun. Have you guys seen this Netflix show or documentary called The Great Hack? If you haven't seen it, even if just for entertainment purposes, but if you followed any of the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, or if you didn't and you want the Cliff's Notes in visual context, you might want to check it out. It's actually a really interesting point of view on the whole Russia situation, meddling in elections. So, lots of work to do. Let's go out and get it done. So, thank you. Okay, should I sit here? I'll sit here.
Well, Carolina, thank you so much for that great conversation and all these points. As a Latina myself, I'm very interested in the topic of diversity. My background is Colombian American. And so many of the students here and part of our audience, they are journalism students, public relations, advertising. So as communicators, how do we step up to the plate, especially, for instance, if we're like Latinos or minorities? How do we change those negative narratives and actually take action as communicators?
I think my one piece of advice is you have to show up. You have to show up. Honestly, you showed up tonight, so I appreciate that. But I think it's part of being in the room where the conversations are being had, and being in the room, showing up to the room as yourself, right? There's all this talk about being your authentic self, or being unafraid to bring all of you to the workplace, or to, in this case, to school. And I think that's how you open the door. I certainly, one of the things that really pulled me into wanting to be a part of VCU was the fact that you guys have such a diverse student body, that there's so many first generationers. I'm a first generationer, so I feel like I can relate to that. I was a woman of color at an institution of higher learning twice over, where we were less than 3%. So you were always like the oddball in the class. And when I transitioned to my professional world, it was either I was the only woman, or I was the youngest woman, or I was the only woman of color, all of these things. And when you show up, if you show up as your whole self and you open your mouth, people will listen. And so I think part of it is bringing that kind of disposition of, I'm here to do my job, I'm here to learn what I'm going to learn, I'm here to also be a part of a community, so I need to do a little teaching myself, I think is really important.
I saw also in your slides you had a very key word when it comes to opening conversations, difficult conversations. You had a very special word that was respect. So how do we create like these safe environments, both in corporate world, in the private sector, or here in the education landscape?
So I think the benefit that I think we all have nowadays is the fact that, well, it's a blessing and a curse in some cases. There is a policing of behavior and language. And I think it's almost an over-rotation of respect. Respect is when you walk into a community and you acknowledge, you look somebody in the eye and you say, I'm here, but I also see you, and you, and you, and you, and everybody else here. And here's my thought. What's yours? I think that is where the place where we need to go to. I think, like I said, we've over-rotated in some cases where it's like, you can't say that, or I heard so-and-so said that. We need to be mindful not to get into that space where you're not too, you're not politicizing or, overly sensitive over things that could be a learning moment, or could be a moment of let's discuss, debate, and arrive at a place of respect.
And of course, the media is the mirror of our society. What does that say about American society?
I'd say I think it says a couple of things. I'm a Capricorn, so it's like the glass is always half empty, type of thing. So, but what I would say is on the half empty thing, it's made us, media has reflected some of the worst in us. It's made us, close our eyes and, tune out other people that we don't like who are on media outlets. It's made us very siloed from each other. So we're not hearing, I want to hear everything about a certain issue. I don't just want to hear the people that are like in my school of thought. But in a good way, I think it's also revved people up. I think social media has revved people up in a way that I don't know anybody was expecting. And even just looking around this room, I get it that we're all, generally in comms and culture and sociology probably, or other, adjacent areas, but we're all tuning in to what's happening, whether it's kind of a, my skim newsletter or it's Twitter. We're all tuning in superficially or in depth into these issues. So I think media has also created the positive side of getting multiple generations, engaged in certain conversations.
And so as a good Latina, like you mentioned, you don't want to be invited to a party and not be invited to dance.
Correct.
Or to talk or to share your thoughts. So we're going to open the floor for questions. Marcus Messner has the microphone.
Yes, if
So
you have
feel
a
free
if
to
you
ask
have a
the question.
question, just raise your hand and I will come around. If you could just introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Ava Hans. I don't know if this is on or not, but so I wrote down my question, and I'm sorry if it's kind of long, but I know that you talked about biases and that we need to identify them, and in my professor, Miss Vivian's class, we continue to learn about our individual biases, and I feel like our parents and family members, in a way, installed these biases like in us. And how you mentioned you're a Capricorn, I'm a Libra, and I absolutely hate confrontation. So how do you in a way like talk to your family members that you love so much and now you think so differently? How do you have that conversation where I know that there is a sort of respect, but that you can actually end up getting something from it? Because I feel like with my father, who's a Republican, he sounds so differently from me, and I feel like we can never really have that conversation. So I just wanted to know if maybe you had, something that has happened in your life, or maybe it could help me in a way.
So great. Thanks for sharing that. What was your name again?
My name is Ava.
Ava. Okay. Ava. That's like I wish I had the silver bullet for that one. What I can say is, just in my own experience, right? My parents are all immigrants. I grew up in a matrixed identity, in the U.S. And a lot of what I learned in the circles that I have been in, either through school or through work, my parents didn't understand. I remember like the watershed moment of walking down the lawn at UVA on graduation day, and my mother's bawling, and I'm just like, oh God, thank God I got my paper. Where's my paper? It was just one of those things, and I couldn't understand how she was perceiving the moment. But it was definitely different from how I perceived the moment. And it took a conversation. I mean, it's your dad. It's not, somebody that you randomly saw at school. It's your dad. And part of what the delicate dance is having a respectful conversation and teaching him something, right? Because he doesn't have access to all the resources and all the people and perspectives that you're engaging in here at VCU or in any other circle that you have. But he's probably just going with the information that he has. A lot of people are just going with the information they are getting from whatever resource they're getting, and that's the best they can do. And if you can impart on somebody else something that's going to open their mind or maybe share a perspective, maybe won't turn around. Maybe he won't turn around overnight, but maybe he will, right? You never know. But I think part of it is sharing your point of view with him or your experience with him in a teachable moment for your parent, which is not always easy, right? Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Yes. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Danny Robinson. I'm Chief Client Officer at the Martin Agency. I have a question about retention. I think the true test of inclusion is not even asking someone to dance, but when you ask them to the after party, because that's when you really.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that what I see is a lot of body work and maybe not a lot of culture work.
Mm-hmm.
And the part that seems to be missing is the culture part of an organization, that once people come in, inclusion is a lot deeper.
Yes.
And can you talk a little about retention? Because I think part of the problem is not necessarily getting people into the building, but keeping them in the building.
Thanks, Danny. I think that's a great question, and I'm happy to just share a little bit, right? And maybe in the anecdote of what I've seen in Silicon Valley, right? That's, I think, one of the cultural environments or one of the workplace culture environments that has probably received the most scrutiny in the past few years. And in the time that I worked with a myriad of companies, going through a variety of things, trying to figure out how do we increase our talent pipeline to make it more diverse, or how do we, people say that we're a toxic culture, how do we change the frat boy culture of Silicon Valley? I wholly agree with you that culture is a big problem. I wouldn't say that the pipeline is not a problem. The pipeline is still a problem. And oftentimes companies don't change their culture because they don't have to. If you have people inside that begin to address, if you bring people inside, you have to build the mechanisms for them to succeed, right? You can't just build, and it's not one size fit all. You've seen Silicon Valley kind of do a lot of shifting around the people that are their employees, right? 10 years ago, they would have been under 25 white males. And through a lot of pressure, they've had to diversify what that composition looks like. And you've had a lot of women say, okay, well, I need a breastfeeding room because I'm having a baby. Or I need, I'm going to need employee training because this is a skill set I don't have. And so once you get them in there, I think once you get them in there, it requires outside counsel in most cultures, most company cultures, as well as internal participation. So you've got to build the employee incentive to say, here's what I would do differently, or here are the things that I think we need in our workplace. So I think it's a combination of, retention happens when people feel happy at work. And people feel happy at work when they want to stay at work. I don't think we're a workforce that says, okay, we're punching the clock and we're out. Americans are among the most consistently working people on the planet. So can you make it a place where people want to be because they can see themselves succeeding, whether that success is measured by money or the success is measured by work satisfaction is, I think, up to the individual person, but there definitely has to be some formal structure around the employee training, employee recruitment, employee compensation, and employee leadership tracking. I think those are kind of the principles that I'm seeing a lot lately. Hope that helped. Okay.
We take one more audience question. Okay, I'll come down.
While you're coming down, you mentioned something about money, and you also talk about the pay gap. Can you address, what are some initiatives to address that?
So I think there's a lot around the pay gap. I think there are a lot of women who are starting to get smart on their market value. It's something that I certainly, with the women that I mentor, say, you better know your market value at all turns of your life. In your academic life, you have to know what you're working towards. You have to know, okay, I'm going to major in this. Here are my professional options. What are my salary options going to look like? And you have to start thinking about those things pretty early, like where you all are. So I think that's important. I think there are a lot of women who are, like I said, becoming more savvy around what their market value is. There are a lot of women who are claiming, or clamoring, I should say, for disclosure of the pay gap. And with outside pressure, companies are having to disclose more openly what the gaps are and make commitments to closing them. But truth is, the gaps are really huge. Latinas actually have the largest gap, making 56 cents on the dollar that every man makes, and that's huge. So if you think about and it's now publicly available by segment of women. So white women have their data, Native women have data, Asian women have data, et cetera. African American women have data. So ladies, remember the two things. One is start to evaluate your professional options and your career monetary aspirations, but also understand what the gap is. And in some cases, the gap is identifiable by sector and industry. So keep your eyes peeled.
Hi, my name is Mary Catherine. We met. Mine's kind of more of a personal question. Earlier, I loved how you were, talking about your family and how you said they immigrated over here. My family immigrated over here from Greece a while ago, and this is just a question. So growing up and still today, going places as easy as the grocery store with my grandmother, being at the checkout line, there's always people there, rolling their eyes or quickly, we've had times of people scanning extra things or thinking that she wouldn't notice. And from a very young age, I'm very protective over my grandparents. I've gotten very, mad over the topic, and now I'm older, I'm getting an education which my grandparents weren't able to do at the time, and I'm still seeing this stuff when I go home, and I feel like with the time, it is getting better, but certain things like that, the language barrier isn't, and I just kind of wanted to know how you think, especially as a professional about to go in the workforce, how you handle something like that.
So, sorry you have to deal with that. So infuriating.
So infuriating.
But what I would say is, you're not alone. It still happens. Even now, when my mother has a very thick accent. She's been here 50 years. She speaks English. She has a very thick accent. She and I will be together, and if she asks for something and they hear the accent, it's automatically some phrase, and I see myself step in really like defensive in my best English, which is often also not that good looking. But what I'd say is, unfortunately, I wish I had the answer that I want to give you, which is our society is increasingly more tolerant. I think we're in a moment where our society is very fractured, and the things that we could laugh about as like a stereotype or make fun of your grandparents because they have a funny accent are no longer funny. And I think more than anything, you're an ambassador for yourself as much as you are for your family, and we all have a right to be here. So I think it's, I hate to, kind of lean on the proverbial turn the other cheek, but part of it is own who you are, own your heritage, and own the moment and your right to be in a place. The more confidence you have in that, I mean, I can't tell you, I'll make a little confession. I'm all about the confessions. I'm Catholic too, so confessions are very natural for me. But I remember when I started a job in the private sector, something very buttoned up, and I didn't grow up buttoned up. I didn't know, like my first job, my mom buys me this thing she calls a suit that was like, it was like not a suit, it was just this horrible thing. And eventually, many years later, somebody told me something that I wish I would have known when I showed up my first day of work in the private sector in this thing that my mother said was an elegant suit. Which is, she said, this mentor of mine said, you gotta get up every day and you have to stand in front of the mirror and you have to put your hands on your hips like Superman or Supergirl or super person these days. And you have to look at yourself in the mirror at least 60 seconds, and you have to tell yourself everything you want other people to say. You're amazing, you're smart. You see all these videos of these YouTube children that are like, saying their positive affirmations at age 3. You, as an adult, need to stand in front of the mirror, do your power pose, and tell yourself, I belong here. I'm the bomb. I'm great, I'm smart, I'm gonna be a journalist, I'm gonna do whatever it is. But don't, in these moments where you feel like that, don't let it shake your confidence. Because if it shakes your confidence, your grandma's watching, and she probably knows you might feel a little ashamed, or you might feel a little embarrassed, and you never want her to feel that way, or your grandparents to feel that way. So stand up for yourself, but also stand up for her. And some of it is just, an exercise of giving yourself a little encouragement. So.
Carolina, thank you so much. This has been really
course.
a treat. And thank you to all of you for coming and joining us in this conversation. And we are going to take that courage, and we're going to take that determination to accomplish all the things that you mentioned.
Excellent. Let's do it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.